All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Idaho State Museum. My name is Liz Hobson, and I am the museum administrator, and want to thank you all for joining us for this special program, Hard History with Darren Parry, the Bear River Massacre. The Idaho State Museum is part of the Idaho State Historical Society, which includes the Idaho State Archives, the Old Idaho Penitentiary and historic sites located throughout the state, and the Idaho State Historic Preservation Office. We offer dynamic and engaging programs that serve Idahoans across the state and have done so for the last 140 years and look forward to many more years to come. We also have a lot of Idaho State Historical Society members in our audience tonight. If you want to raise your hands. Thank you all for joining us and supporting all the work we do for Idaho. I also want to thank those who made donations online or in person for tonight's program. A portion of all donations will go to support the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation's fundraising efforts for the Boa Ogoi Cultural Interpretive Center. A portion of the donations made here tonight will also go to this cause, so thank you very much. Before we begin, I have some housekeeping items. We will be taking questions after the program, so if you have any, please raise your hand at the end and we'll bring a microphone to you. And on your chair, you will find a survey. We would love for you to fill that out and let us know your thoughts on tonight's program and how we can better serve you, our audience, in the future. And directly after the program, Darren Parry will be signing copies of his book, The Bear River Massacre, that you can purchase tonight right outside in the lobby. It is now my pleasure to introduce the Executive Director of the Idaho State Historical Society, Jan Gallimore. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It's nice to see so many people here. We love that we've been able to deliver a lot of virtual programs, but we love it even more when everyone is in the house. So we're really happy to see everyone. I am so honored to introduce Darren Parry tonight to share the story of the Bear River Massacre on this 159th eve of its anniversary on January 29th. As many of you are likely aware, the Bear River Massacre is one of the largest massacres of Native Americans in the West. And Darren, we are so happy that you're here to share this difficult story because I know it comes from your heart, it comes from your family history, it comes from your really great passion of sharing stories and making sure that stories of the past are understood to the people of today, why they're meaningful, why they matter, and how we can just never forget. Darren is the former chairman of the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation. He's the driving force behind the proposed Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation Boa Ogoi Cultural Center, which is near Preston, Idaho. Parry served on the boards of the American West Heritage Center, which is in Logan, Utah, and the Utah State Museum Board. He has also served on the advisory board of the Huntsman Cancer Center in Salt Lake City, Utah. He's an educator by training in secondary education with an emphasis in history. He graduated from Weber State University in Ogden. Darren also was instrumental as we were building our new state museum and consulting with us about tribal history and especially the exhibitions related to the Bear River Massacre in the museum. So please do go visit those when you have a moment. And the State Historical Society Board of Trustees awarded Darren the 2017 Esto Perpetual Work for his work on award for his work on sharing this amazing story and for his tireless efforts at preserving the story and then working on sharing the impact and the value and the importance of this National Historic Landmark site there at Boa Ogoi. And I wanted to share some personal moments because I think those are always really important. And I represented Idaho Governor Otter and made comments at the 150th formal commemoration at the Bear River Massacre Site in 2013. And it was interesting, I had to, on that moment, like I had about 5 minutes to prepare because it was, there was some ice that happened and so the governor couldn't get there in time. So luckily we had gotten there the day before. So they asked me to step in and say a few words. And of course, that's not hard, but it was very, overwhelming because you want to do it right? You're in this really amazing place and It was such an emotional ceremony. The power of the site was so profound. I hope that many of you get to visit when you can. The wind became perfectly still. The snow just like dumped out of the sky. The weather changed almost instantly. But the eagles still circled when the tribal elders sang and the drummers drummed. And the elders shared their story. Darren shared his family story. At the finale, there was a smudging ceremony everyone got to take part in. It was so powerful. And I think that when we experience those kinds of profound sacred places, we're so moved and we feel, and we can't help but be transformed when you are in a place like that. And that was the day that I met Darren Parry. And it has been a great gift that he's been my friend ever since, and his wife, Mel, as well. It's my honor to introduce him to you this evening. I thank you all for joining us here at the Idaho State Museum, where we share stories of the past that help us to frame the present, but also help to shape the future. And I'm so happy that you're all here. Please join me in welcoming my dear friend, Darren Parry.
I need to find the water. Well, thank you for having me. I love to drive up to Boise. I live in Logan, the Cache Valley, and I would move here tomorrow if somebody could find me a job. So I want you to know that American history for a long time was written and taught as a single story. It was a narrative of nation building about unending progress that united its participants into this single American experience. It was a national success story, celebrating human triumphs made possible in a society that was based on principles of liberty and equality, or so we thought. I'm still patiently waiting for the liberty and equality for all part. In years past, historians have sometimes ignored or dismissed peoples whose experience didn't conform to this master narrative. Often dismissed were the experiences of the American Indian. After all, our story is one of suffering and decline, rather than one of unending progress or happiness. But times change, and the history and the stories that we tell changes too. I have come to realize over this lifetime of mine that when we reduce history to just data, and when we remove the emotional or the storytelling side of history, we lose, I think, some of the humanity that makes history so important. And I think that's why our story tonight is so important. If you were to drive north along Highway 91, just past Preston, Idaho, you'll round a curve that opens to the beautiful panoramic Bear River bottoms. On a cold winter day, if you know where to look, you can still see the steam rising from the river's edge. 159 years ago, this Saturday, it was at that spot that more than 700 Shoshones had spent their winter, as they had done for centuries. Hot springs that were nearby provided a welcome place for them to catch their breath, catch up with friends and family during the cold winter months. We called this place the home of the lungs, Moso Dequani. A half a mile to the east, Colonel Patrick Edward Connor and his 220 cavalry soldiers had the same bird's eye view early in the morning of January 29th in 1863 as they made their way down the ravine towards a sleeping Indian village by the steaming waters. You know, when something terrible happens, where human lives are lost, it always takes on a different meaning. The 14.6 acres of the World Trade Center, the beaches of Normandy, a homemade memorial at the side of the road where a tragic fatal accident occurred. Places that haunt and hurt for the wounds that they hold, but still compel us to go back for some unexplainable comfort. Have you ever had a memory sneak out of your eye and roll down your cheek? I have that all the time when I think about the massacre of my people at Bear River. For thousands of years, tribal elders would sit down with the young children and they'd tell them stories. The stories were always the same. There was never a word out of place. It had to be that way. It had to be accurate. Our children needed to hear the stories as their elders had heard the stories. Because as you know, in my culture, nothing was ever written down. I went through this process with my grandmother, a giant really. Her name was Mae Timbimboo Parry. She would sit for hours and tell me stories about how the coyote stole fire or how the bald eagle became bald. And then with reverence in her tone and sometimes a tear in her eye, she would relate the story of the massacre at Boa Ogoi. There's an old Indian saying that I love that says, when an old Indian dies, a library burns. Think about that. That was never as true as it was about my grandmother. As I grew older and I attended school, I developed this great love for history. And then one day, sitting in class, I think in high school, I suddenly realized something. That none of the stories that my grandmother told me were in our history books. But how could that be? I had always believed that historical events were an absolute. I believed that events that transpired over time had one conclusion. But I've come to realize as I've gotten older that history is about perspective. Whose perspective? And then one day I read a quote that was attributed to the great English leader, Winston Churchill. And he said that history is only written by the victors. Well, that makes perfect sense then why Native American history is never written. My great-great-great-grandfather was named Chief Sagwitch. Him and his people lived like their forefathers had lived for hundreds, if not thousands of years. We were hunters and gatherers. We traveled with the changing seasons. The Shoshones referred to themselves as Niwa, which means the people. We looked upon the place, the earth, as not just a place to live, but something so sacred and special that we called her mother. She was always the provider of our livelihoods. You see, to my native people, the mountains and the streams and the plains stand forever, and seasons walk around annually. We traveled to different parts of this country when the game was plentiful and the seeds and berries were abundant. If you could imagine, it was a hard way of life. I'm sure they were never more than a few days away from starvation. But I think it was a happy life. Back then, every member of the tribe got up every day and worked hard for its survival. That family relationship was sacred, as it should be to you and your families. In the summer of 1847, Sagwitch received word from other tribes that there was a group of white settlers making their way through Wyoming, heading towards the Salt Lake Valley. And on July 31st, Sagwitch had the opportunity to travel to Salt Lake City to meet with a man named Brigham Young. Now, he didn't meet with Brigham Young that day because of his illness. He met with a man named Heber C. Kimball. Heber C. Kimball said this at the conclusion of the meeting: "You do not own the land. The lands belong to our Heavenly Father, and we calculate to plow and plant it. If you can imagine, within months, disputes arose between the Mormons and the Shoshone people over the land, and I think what the payment of rent. Sagwich's life and that of his people was about to get complicated. Over the next few years, as more and more saints arrived, good land was now becoming scarce. It was in 1856 that the church sent a man named Peter Mon north to settle where I live today, the Cache Valley, for good. That one act would have a devastating effect on my people. Not long after, other saints would soon arrive to that beautiful valley. In those early days, the saints referred to Sagwich and his people as the friendly ones. As resources began to become scarce, those same saints began to describe us as thieves and beggars, which was probably true from their perspective. The irony, though, in that for me, was that the saints themselves had suffered so much hate and injustice as they trekked across this country in pursuit of religious freedom. It's hard for me to believe that they could be found guilty of doing the same thing to my people. Peter Mon, who is now the area authority for the church in the Cache Valley, said this: "With extraordinarily good luck, the California volunteers will completely wipe them out. We wish this community rid of all such parties. And if Colonel Connor can be successful in reaching that bastard class of humans who play with the lives of the peaceable and the law-abiding citizens in this way, we shall be pleased to acknowledge our obligations." With this development and the use of the California and Oregon trails that also cut through the heart of Shoshone land, I believe my people soon had three options: beg for food, starve, or steal. You now have two different groups living two different lifestyles. Early in January in 1863, the Mormon settlers from Cache Valley and those using the California and Oregon trails began sending letters to Salt Lake City for someone to come to put an end to the Indian depredations. Arrest warrants were issued by a federal judge in Salt Lake for the chiefs Pocatello, Bear Hunter, and Sagwich. Colonel Patrick Edward Connor and his California volunteers from Camp Douglas, Utah, and Salt Lake were mustered into service. A Mormon scout named Porter Rockwell, who served as a guide, led Colonel Connor and his men just north of Logan, Utah today, near Preston, Idaho, where Battle Creek meets Boa Ogoi, or we call the Bear River. Sagwich, being an early riser, got up as usual on the morning of January 29th. He left his teepee and stepped outside and surveyed the area around the camp. He noticed to the hills to the southeast that they were covered with this steaming mist. He seemed to watch it, and it seemed to creep lower down the hill. The chief suddenly figured out what was happening. It was the 250 horses that had been traveling all night that were lathered up in the deep snow. And it was the steam coming off the horses that he could see. He started calling to his sleeping village to awake. They quickly gathered their bows and arrows and spears. They gathered whatever they could find to fight with. My grandmother said some of the women picked up their woven willowing pans and baskets to use them for shields. The troops got closer, and without so much as asking for the chiefs, the soldiers began to fire upon the Indians. But arrows are nothing compared to the sidearms and rifles of the army. The soldiers massacred men, women, and children. My grandmother said that our people were being slaughtered like wild rabbits. The massacre started early in the morning and lasted until early afternoon. The Bear River that was slightly frozen earlier that morning was now starting to flow. The Shoshone people were now jumping into the river to try to escape, especially the women and their children. The blazing white snow was now brilliant red with blood. The willow trees that were used as hiding places were now bent down as if in defeat. Many of the women that had jumped into the river to try to escape with their babies, almost all of them died. There was one woman named Angie Chi. She was a young, brand new mother. She jumped into the river and hid under an overhanging bank. Now you might ask yourself, how could they jump into this cold river in January? But where this bank was, there was a hot spring nearby, and she knew where she could go to find safety. Angie Chi, when she got under the bank, she found herself there with 10 other women who had had the same idea. Angie Chi lived to be more than 100 years old, and she would often tell this story to the young children at Washakie, the Indian community that the church had established for our people years and years after the massacre. She also told of her baby that began to cry. And she'd tell this story to the young children and told them how she had to drown her own baby in order to protect the location of the other women. Angie Chi also showed the children the 7 bullet wounds that she'd had to her body throughout that encounter. The cruelest killing, though, was that of Bear Hunter. They knew that he was a leader. The soldiers had already shot him. They'd stabbed him, they'd whipped him and kicked him and tortured him in many ways. Through all of this, that old chief wouldn't die, but he wouldn't even utter a word or cry out for mercy. Because of this, one of the military men became angry. He stepped to a burning campfire and heated his bayonet until it was glowing red. He then ran that hot piece of metal through that chief's head from ear to ear. Chief Bear Hunter went to his grave a man of honor, and he left behind his wife and many small children. At the end of the massacre, Connor allowed a handful of Mormon settlers to walk the village. James Martino recorded in his journal that he was sickened by what he saw. He said that many of the squaws were killed because they would not lie down and submit to be ravished. He later told Peter Mon of sickening accounts of the inhuman acts by the soldiers. He recorded after the Indians had been routed, they killed the wounded by knocking them in the head with an axe. The next morning, Brigham Young sent locals, William Head, William Hull, and William Nelson, to travel to the massacre site to look for survivors. Hull later recorded in his journal, "We drove our sleighs as far as the river. The first sight to greet us was an old man walking, head bowed, lamenting the dead. He didn't speak to us, and he soon left, heading towards the north. Never will I forget the scene. There were dead bodies everywhere. I counted 8 deep in one place, and in several places there were 3 to 5 deep. All in all, the 3 of us counted more than 400 dead. 2/3 of that number being women and children. We found 2 Indian women alive whose thighs had been broken by bullets. 2 little boys and 1 little girl who looked to be the age of about 3. The little girl, badly wounded, having received 8 bullet wounds to her tiny body. We took them on our horses to the sleigh and made them as comfortable as possible. I can imagine at this time that Sagwitch, who had escaped, was now realizing that he indeed lived in two different worlds. One group was greedy, wanted everything, wanted the land, and felt it was their manifest destiny. The other group only wanted to travel as they'd always done for centuries. One group made their wishes and dreams come true by making themselves a conqueror at the expense of a defenseless people who only wanted to be left alone. Ralph Smith, a local area Franklin settler, said, as he summed up the sentiments of the local Mormons, when he said, "We looked upon the massacre as gruesome, but necessary." And then he added, "The work of Patrick Edward Connor and his soldiers was nothing less than an intervention from our Heavenly Father." Mary Ann Weston Mon, wife of Peter Mon, wrote in the local paper, "The residents of Cache Valley regarded Connor's efforts as an imposition of providence in our behalf, and commented that the Indians had caused so much trouble that patience had ceased to be a virtue." Henry Ballard, bishop of the Logan First Ward, mentioned the massacre in his journal and commented, "This put a quietus upon the Indians. The Lord raised up his foe in Colonel Connor to punish them without us having to do it. We had bore a great deal from them and still had been feeding them, yet some of the wicked spirits among them would stir up trouble against us." George Farrell, secretary of the Logan First Ward, recorded in the official minutes that we, the people of Cache Valley, looked upon the movement of Colonel Connor as an intervention from the Almighty God, as the Indians had been a source of great annoyance to us. And finally, in a letter dated February 4th, from Peter Mon to Brigham Young, he said this, "I feel my skirts rid of their blood. They rejected the way of life and salvation that we have pointed out to them, and thus they have perished, relying upon their own strength and wisdom." Just north of Preston, Idaho, you'll find an old monument just off of Highway 91. This monument was erected in 1932 by the good people of Franklin County. It was meant to remember what had happened at that site, to tell the story of the events of that fateful day. It was a celebrated event. The whole community came together to tell the story of their people. What the monument really accomplished for me is that it gives people a reason to forget. That monument strips us of our obligation to find out for ourselves what took place. And that monument tells us how it wants the past to be remembered. You see, humans have great memories for what they want to remember. In commemorating this battle, you forget the uglier parts of history, and you only focus on the heroism of the soldier and the saint. That's the kind of Daughters of Utah Pioneers monument that exists there today. The problem is that narrative now becomes a story. It's not a story about my people and what happened. It becomes a monument to the brave soldiers and the pioneer women who took care of them upon the conclusion. In constructing a monument like this, you firm up memory and you create a false history. I'll read you what the plaque says. The plaque reads, "Attacks by the Indians on the peaceful inhabitants in this vicinity led to the final battle here on January 29th in 1863. The conflict occurred in deep snow and bitter cold. Scores of wounded soldiers were taken from the battlefield to the Latter-day Saint community of Franklin, Idaho. Here, pioneer women, trained through trials and necessities of frontier living, accepted the responsibility of caring for the wounded until they could be removed to Camp Douglas, Utah. 2 Indian women, it's the first time we're mentioned, found alive, were given homes in Franklin. So my question is that really what happened? The problem with that narrative for me is that it gives us one point of view from one generation's perspective, 69 years after the actual massacre. It's like a view from a small window that's been carefully placed to exclude a whole quadrant of a beautiful landscape. You only get to see what they want you to see. It reinforces the view that Indians were savages and went so far as to label our women and children as enemy combatants. It reinforces the view that violence on the frontier was necessary for the survival of Mormon communities. And it went so far as to show us what the consequences would be if both groups tried to share that same space. What if the plaque had been written from the viewpoint of the Shoshone people? Would it have read the same? Maybe it would have said something like this. The massacre of the Northwestern Band with Shoshone Nation occurred in this vicinity on January 29th in 1863. Colonel Patrick Edward Connor and his California volunteers from Camp Douglas, Utah, attacked a sleeping Indian village in the early morning hours of the day. The soldiers shot, raped, bludgeoned, and bayoneted several hundred men, women, and children to their death. The Indians fought back with the limited weapons available to them, but the band was all but annihilated. So which version of the massacre is correct? The answer will always lie in your perspective. The events that took place on that cold January morning have long been forgotten by most, if at all heard about. Maybe guilt or remorse has silenced all those who one day may have wanted to know the truth. But I find that there's a new generation of people that really have a desire to listen and to learn. And it's not because we're looking to have things made right. We're not. But I believe that those who died at Bear River that day have a God-given right to be heard. Their voices have always spoken to me from the dust. We as Native people, we remember and we honor the past because it allows us to go on and succeed in the future. Someone once said to me, never let your past experiences harm your future. Your past cannot be altered and your future doesn't deserve the punishment. I am grateful that past negative experiences didn't adversely affect Chief Sagwich's future, because as a direct descendant, it would have altered mine. I believe today that the most successful Native Americans are those who can best balance culture and change. We honor our culture. We honor those who have gone before. They are really important to us. We honor them and their traditions. But I have realized that we live in an ever-changing world today, and it's my job as a tribal leader to prepare our youth to change and to be able to succeed with it. The massacre of Boa Ogoi has taught me many lessons over the years. Let me tell you a couple of them. It has taught me that bad things happen to people. How we respond to those negative experiences will determine our character and who we become. It has taught me to offer unconditional forgiveness. but it doesn't mean we need to forget. It has taught me that as we preserve history, it is important that everyone's views are respected and represented. It has taught me that everyone has a story worthy of being told. What is your story? Because your story is equally as important as mine. And it has taught me that the souls of my ancestors peer out from behind my mask of skin, and that through my memories, they get to live again. Tell me a fact, and I will learn. Tell me a truth, and I will believe. But tell me a story, and that will live in my heart forever. Ultimately, the story of Bear River is our story. And in some ways, I hope you can respect the story that we want to have told, as well as realize and recognize your role in that story. History doesn't always affirm us. Sometimes history challenges us to think about an uglier past that we'd probably rather not have. But that's really the power and the benefit of history. It connects us to the past. History connects us to our humanity and our inhumanity. But it always offers us a way to move forward, especially in a circumstance like this with the Shoshone people, moving forward in a story that connects us not in the prettiest of ways, but to move forward to this new relationship that is a 21st century relationship that I think is based on respect. Respect for the truth and what happened in that past moment. Then, and only then, is when you get the possibility for reconciliation. But how do we make reconciliation possible in such a seemingly divided world that we once lived in, where our mindset today is that I have rights, versus an indigenous mindset that says, I have obligations. Obligations to the past, present, and future generations. One day, a Shoshone hunter brought home a sizable kill, far too much to be eaten by his family. A mountain man nearby asked the hunter how he was going to store the excess. You see, drying technologies were available at that time. The hunter seemed puzzled by this question. And he looked at the mountain man and said, store the meat? Why would I do that? Instead, he sent out an invitation to come to this great feast. Soon the whole village had gathered together around the fire, and they ate every last morsel of that animal. Well, this seemed to puzzle the mountain man further. He again asked, given the uncertainty of fresh meat in the forest, why didn't you just store that meat for your family in times of need? Store the meat? The hunter said. I store the meat in the belly of my brother. As we become successful by today's standards, can I make one suggestion? I hope our status in this life will be determined by not how much we accumulate, but by how much we share and give away. And then when we do, we show an abundance of gratitude. A wonderful book by Robin Wall Kimmerer says that gratitude is much more than a polite thank you. It is a thread that connects us in this deep relationship, simultaneously physical and spiritual, as our bodies are fed and our spirits nourished by the sense of belonging, which is the most vital of foods. Gratitude creates a sense of abundance, of knowing that you have enough of what you need. In that climate of sufficiency, our hunger for more goes away, and we only take what we need out of respect of the generosity of the giver. Wealth should always be understood as having enough to share. And the practice of dealing with abundance should be to give it away. I think if you were to take a look around tonight, I think we're as varied and colorful as a beautiful field of wildflowers. We each bring with us our own beautiful traits and characteristics. As you look around tonight, I hope you can truly see others and see the good in what you see. I think we need to be able to see each other through each other's eyes. I think when this happens, the possibilities for collaboration is endless. The differences that we all bring to the table can be the strengths that we all draw from each other. Our life has brought us knowledge. Knowledge brings understanding, and greater understanding brings openness to others' ways of seeing and being. Don't ever be afraid to forge a new path. It's important for you to remember that nobody is you, and that is your superpower. Be the one who celebrates the different colors of our skins and embraces the opportunities to learn from each other. Be the one who breaks the cycle. If you were ever judged wrongly, choose to be understanding. If you were ever rejected, choose acceptance. If you were ever shamed, be the one who chooses compassion. Be the person you needed when things didn't go well and you were hurting, and not the person that hurt you. And always, instead of holding onto a grudge, be the first one to forgive. I think about these values and these stories from my people and the lessons of life that they truly teach us. I believe they would want to teach us to live as one, to cherish our likenesses but celebrate our differences, to honor our stewardship to this earth and all things that live on it and the sky above it. They would tell us to have gratitude for what we have, for those who made the trails for us to follow. They would tell us to have reverence in our hearts. They would tell us to spread the kind of love that awakens the soul, that makes each one of us reach for more, that plants the fire in our hearts and brings peace to our minds. That is the kind of love that the world needs today. Love, kindness, forgiveness, acceptance. I see you. I hear you. I respect you. Those affirmations and many others like them are what I like to call medicine words. I hope we can speak medicine words to those people who are around us, but especially to our young people. Words that bless, inspire, and empower. When we speak medicine words, we build unity, and we strengthen our culture and our nation. One day, I'd given a presentation to a bunch of second grade kids, and I made the mistake of asking for questions. Well, what could they come up with, really? A little girl on the front row raised her hand and looked me dead in the eye, and she said, "How did you get to be the chief?" So I told her this story that my grandmother had told me. I said, when a little Shoshone boy or girl does an act of kindness or service, the chief in the tribe would always give that boy or girl an eagle feather. I then asked this girl, what would happen if that boy or girl kept doing kind things for everyone? What do you think would happen? And she answered, well, they would get more eagle feathers. And I told her she was right. I said, what if they kept doing that until they became an adult? What do you think would happen? And she said, well, by then they would have so many eagle feathers. I said, you're right. And I said, then one day when the chief gets ready to die, and the chief is always the chief until he passes, he calls everyone together. And he said, I'm about to meet my maker. I want every one of you to show me your eagle feathers. And then I told this girl it was the person that had the most eagle feathers would become the new chief. You see, the chief isn't always the bravest or the toughest or the strongest or the one that killed the most white people. I have to add that all the time. The chief is always the one who led a life of service and kindness to those around him or her. So I told that class, and I tell every class I go see, go be a chief. Be a good sibling. Be the kind of person that people want to be with. Now I reminded her that she's not going to be a Shoshone chief one day, but she will become a leader in her community, and people will want to be with her because of those qualities. In that way, you will be a leader. Leadership that is not rooted in power and authority, but in service and wisdom. In closing, can I just tell you what we're doing at the Massacre Site currently? In 2018, we were able to purchase all of the Bear River Massacre Site, 550 acres of that sacred land. I always pause and kind of have to laugh that we had to buy back the land that used to be ours anyway. How ironic, right? This land purchase, though, was one of the most significant events in our tribe's history. It means everything to our small tribe. Not only was Boa Ogoi home for centuries, but it's also a sacred burial place where more than 400 of our people lie today. I believe with all my heart that those who died at Bear River that day played a significant role in the purchase of that land. I have felt their influences many times as I've negotiated for land and talked to others, and they've opened seemingly impossible doors. Their voices have always spoken to me from the dust. I believe their story needs to be told. But as important as it is to tell the story of the people, it's equally as important to tell the story of the land. But where do you begin? How do you begin to address cultural and environmental injustices that have taken place for centuries? Environmental justice affirms the sacredness of Mother Earth and ecological unity and the interdependency of all species and the right to be free from ecological destruction. Another key part of this land restoration process was to develop partnerships, and we have with Utah State University. My first visit was there. I met with professors in the Natural Resources Department. And I said, can we go up to the massacre site? And we did, and we walked it, and I said, I want to restore the land to what it would have looked like in 1863. Get rid of all the invasive species and replant things that would have been there. In this way, my small way, that we began healing this land that has suffered so much trauma over the years. Our first interaction more than 3 years ago has brought us where we are today. And we are way down the road on land restoration as we speak. Some of the things that we want to do require buy-in from landowners upstream, farmers and ranchers. How are they going to feel about the reintroduction of beaver into the ecosystem? How are they going to feel about redoing certain farming techniques that are easier on the land? The partnership that we've developed with Utah State University has just begun. This will be a living, learning classroom for decades. The reality, though, of finally being able to tell that story is powerful. The purchase of the Massacre Site will help our people to reconnect to this sacred space while providing a new emphasis as stewards. Voices that have been quiet for a long time are now being heard. Alliances between us and the school and other groups are now being forged. As important as that historical restoration is, the preservation of the stories and the people is equally as important. We are now just beginning to take back that narrative. Thank you very much for having me tonight, and I'd be more than happy to take questions.
Any questions? Oh, I'll come over with the microphone.
I just want to say my name is Richard Gardner, and long about 1985, I was working for Governor John Evans, a resident of that area and a good Mormon as well. And we were looking for places of natural beauty or historic significance that might be recognized by the National Park Service. It was my great honor to go with a historian from the National Park Service to what was then called the Battle of Bear River, and to learn about that story and about the ambitious and frustrated Colonel Connor, who after all really wanted to be fighting in the Civil War at that time, and perhaps took out that ambition elsewhere. And to walk that ground and to learn that it was no battle whatsoever. And I feel is one of the small contributions I made in my career to have helped in changing that name.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Yes, I was wondering, is there history on who ordered the colonel to go and do what he did? Was that from Washington or?
No, it was, so there was a federal judge in Salt Lake who had taken all these letters and complaints from those using the California Oregon Trails miners that were heading west for a better life. There were attacks along that trail. And then the depredations, the Indians begging for food because their way of life had been altered. I think the Mormons were tired of it and just wanted the problem to go away. And so these letters stated such, so a federal judge issued arrest warrants for the three chiefs. And there was really no one in Salt Lake City that wanted that job to go serve it. The Mormons hated Colonel Connor and his men, and they didn't like the Mormons either. So that relationship was not good at all. Connor, in fact, founded the Salt Lake Tribune in opposition to the Deseret News. They wanted more liberal news in Salt Lake. So but he was the only one really willing and capable enough to serve these arrest warrants. Before he left Salt Lake, though, in his own paper, he did an interview that said that he had no intentions of arresting anyone. He said, "I'm not going to deprive my men a little fun of Indian killing."
Oh my.
And so when he left Salt Lake City, he knew exactly what they had in mind. And it wasn't to arrest the three chiefs. He was going to make sure that even the children were not going to live long enough to get to adulthood.
And were any charges ever brought up against him?
Pardon?
Were any charges brought against him?
No, in fact, he was Colonel Patrick Edward Connor, and at the end of the massacre, a couple of months later, they promoted him to Brigadier General.
Wow.
Now, that was one of the first massacres in the winter months. Sand Creek happens the next year in Colorado. And they followed his playbook. Attack early in the morning when in the Indian winter encampment when they're most vulnerable. And so that became the playbook going forward. Years later, Connor, who was also known as the father of mining in Utah, because his men were so bored, he was sending them out into the hills to try to find things. And he got in trouble in another small Indian massacre years later. And the Army finally said, "You need to go." So, he left the Army and stayed in Salt Lake, and he's buried there in the Salt Lake Cemetery today.
After this atrocity, was there ever any attempt to cede property or compensate the Shoshone in any way?
There was an act in Congress a few years later, and they tried finding us a piece of land that was out in Nevada. And then they looked at it and they deemed it not very good. So it was never done. That act of Congress is still active today, but we were never given reservation land. So we were one of the few tribes that did not go to a reservation. We, for good or bad, assimilated into the local culture. And good in the respect that we're not on a reservation that has all the problems of a reservation. Bad in the respect that not being on a reservation, we lose our language and culture much quicker. And so there's pros and cons to both, but we're trying to navigate that.
Do you know the meaning of Timbimboo and its significance and how that name came about?
Timbimboo, I believe, means rock rider. And so I don't know. I know Chief Sagwitch, he took that name after the massacre. He wasn't known by that earlier than that, but I'm not exactly sure, even being my third great grandfather. But he was known by about 3 or 4 different names throughout his life. But that was pretty common for, you'd be born with one name and then be called something else later. And then, so Timbimboo would have came after he joined the LDS Church in 1873, 10 years later. All of the survivors joined the LDS Church in a mass baptism 10 years after the massacre.
Other questions? All right.
You're going to get a workout. No, you're good.
And thank you, Darren. I really enjoyed your book and I enjoyed your talk tonight. And, what I find really saddening and also very interesting is that if you look to nations as close as Canada, right, who have truth and reconciliation committees and who have structures in place and have performed actions that demonstrate that there is remorse, right, and a willingness to move forward. Sure. The United States has not done that. Right, no president in U.S. history, there's been no act of Congress, right, that acts or performs a formal apology, right, or recognition of what's taken place. And I think that one of the most important steps towards reconciliation would be that acknowledgement, right? And so I see one of the main takeaways from your book and from your talk tonight is the power of storytelling, right, and the power that stories can have, particularly about the past, right, and about injustices of the past to influence people and to persuade them and to form that personal connection, right, that human connection going forward. And I hope that by writing this book and telling this story, which is so deeply personal to you and your people, that you've seen some change and that you can appreciate some difference, right? And I was wondering if you could address that maybe if since 2018, since the purchase of the Massacre Site and since the publication of your book and through giving talks such as this, if you've noticed any change or any difference in that small amount of time, right? Because it was 150 years essentially where it was called the battle, right? It wasn't called the massacre. And that's something that you've contributed to changing that narrative. And I wonder, is that starting to gain purchase? Is that starting to gain currency in the mainstream, do you think?
Yeah, thanks for that question. My wife and I have talked about this often, about the speed at which I find change happening. And when I was younger, I remember my grandmother telling me one day, and look, she was an activist. She was a go-getter. And I'll tell you why in a second, why I think she was that. But she told me one day, she said, Darren, no one has ever wanted to hear our story before. One day you will have to make them listen. But what I'm finding, especially as we go on, and I've written the book and other things, that people are really interested and they really want to know and they want to do better. And I don't think the government's ever going to apologize. I don't think the LDS Church is going to apologize, and I think they should. But I'm not holding my breath for any of that, and we're moving forward and going onward, knowing that's not going to happen. I mean, Canada led the way in honoring Indigenous people with land acknowledgements. I think Utah State just did one this 2 months ago, it came out. And I think we're getting a little better in Utah with land acknowledgements. And that is just a small piece of at least acknowledging whose land, you're on. But I'm certainly not going to hold my breath for anything more than that. All I can do is what I can do, and is share the story in a way that doesn't make you walk out of here thinking, well, he guilted us all night long and we owe him a big apology. I think it's important to share hard things, but I think at the end of the day, it's what can we do now to come together and make this world better? And that's kind of why I ended the talk a little more positive with some storytelling and positive things that we can do together to make this world better, because that's what we need to do. We're all going to go through hard things. So we just need to recognize that. Now, my grandmother, Mae, she was one of the ones that was really instrumental in getting it changed from the Battle of Bear River to the Bear River Massacre. She'd gone to Washington, D.C. more than 10 times. I was at her home one day as a young married man with 3 kids, and I remember her getting a phone call, and she just answered it like it was the lady across the street, and she said, "Oh, yeah, I could be there. Yeah, I can be there in about 45 minutes. And I go, "Who was that?" "Oh, it was President Clinton. He's flying into the Salt Lake Airport. He wants to see me." Good hell. I didn't even know you knew anything about him. But you know what? In 1932, when I talked about the unveiling of that monument, I have a picture at home of a stage, the monument with a sheet on it, not unveiled yet. 10 of our men sitting on the front of the stage in full regalia, smiling and laughing. And I thought, the community invited them and said, "We're going to unveil this monument to what happened here. And please come, you're part of it." And so they were there not knowing really what to expect. And I'm sure when they unveiled that and read that plaque, I don't know what the men thought, but I know there was a 13-year-old girl, because her dad and mom were there, so I'm sure she was there, 13-year-old girl named Mae Timbimboo, who read that plaque and said, "Oh, hell no, no. That is not how this is going to be remembered." She'd already been to boarding school. She'd come home and continued her education at Bear River High School and then Elias Business College, where she got an English degree. And then she began writing down all of the history. So because of her, we have it. But I know that day, at that moment, she said, "Nope, that's not how this is going to be remembered." But you got to think, when she lived, and she was a woman, which was a strike. She was a woman of color, and she was a minority. And so her voice was never really heard. And that's why she told me, "One day you will have to make them listen," but I've never had to make anybody listen. I've been very blessed because you all want to know. And it's been wonderful to see that.
I want to know more about Bear River Massacre, and what you said is exactly what my history book said too.
Yay, see, so we're changing. Yeah, the year before COVID, I visited 70 elementaries in 1 year to just free of charge to share my culture with 4th grade classes, because in Utah, it's 4th grade Utah history. Even though the massacres in Idaho were the federal government says we're a Utah tribe, but man, there were no borders back then, and we spent most of our time in southern Idaho. I'd say we're an Idaho tribe as much as anything, but the Idaho tribes don't want us here either, so we just try to be nice, so.
All right, I think that's all the questions. So thank you once again for this wonderful presentation. And thank you all for coming tonight. And I do think Darren will be signing books out in the lobby. So have a wonderful night and hope to see you back here at the museum soon.